let me admit that after listening very carefully to the presentation that we had so far, I really don't know why I was invited, because all the people who already made their presentations were so knowledgeable, and we can learn so much from them. I really don't know what I'm doing here, because I'm a very hesitant person who hardly know few of the questions and definitely have very few answers. So I'm really very happy that I had that education this evening. Let me start by saying that Jeremiah was right. And I'm not talking about Jeremiah Wright. I'm talking about biblical Jeremiah. And there is a very famous debate in the book of Jeremiah between Jeremiah and a false prophet by the name of Hananiah, the son of Azur. That's a time of war. And that's why I remember that debate, and it really resembles what we have here in many ways. I'm not going to give you all the details of that debate, but the main point of Hananiah ben Azur is that peace is around the corner, and it really depends only on us. And within, I really don't remember the details, I think within 1 year, we are going to have peace. And Jeremiah, the angry prophet, the one who is always pessimistic, and I guess for a reason, tells us that peace is not going to come next year, not in 2 years, not in 3 years, not in 4 years. He believes that it will come at the end, that it will take 70 years. And as a result of his, very pessimistic stance, he is put into the prison. But let me tell you, he was right. And the only thing that happened with Hananiah ben Azur within the son of Azur, within 1 year, is that he died, probably punished by his Almighty for his daring to foresee the future and understand the past so clearly. I listened to the presentation before me, and really very impressive people. And on some aspects of what happened in Iran, in Iraq, and also in Iran, I'm more puzzled now than I was when I came here. I'll give you a couple of examples, and that would be, I think, quite enough to make my point. What is the number of Iraqi fatalities in that war? What is the number? Okay, we heard all kinds of numbers. Is it 30,000? Is it 1 million? Is 150,000 the maximal number or the minimal number? I still don't know, okay? And believe me, I listened very carefully, and we are talking huge differences, huge differences. So, to what's going to happen in the future is more difficult to say what happened in the past. And we don't know the answers about the past. So what are we that we can say, that's what's going to happen in the future, we have the answers? I personally don't have the answers. I can tell you, I admit that, and maybe I was invited here in vain. Let me tell you one more thing. We heard a couple of people relating to Iran. I really know very little on Iran, very little. But one thing I do know is that Persians in Iran are the majority, but it's very far from being a monolithic country, a homogenic country. Maybe there are 52% who are Persians. How about the 10 million Kurds, for instance? Do they think exactly, do they bargain exactly the way the other people do? I really don't know. We are living in a world of uncertainty. We always live in a world of uncertainty. It's true, it is true concerning our personal life. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or an hour from now, and we don't know what's going to happen even today, and the same goes for decision makers. If someone goes to a decision maker and suggests a solution, a perfect solution, a just solution, well, you know, one thing that I also do in my very humble life is that I'm involved quite deeply in game theory, and I know to prove mathematically, very easy, that there is no perfect solution to any political or social problem. So if you have the pretension of suggesting that, well, think twice. Think twice. Things are really very far from being certain. Well, we heard that notion of mission accomplished. And of course, the reference is to a quotation of George W. Bush in 2003. He said it more than once, mission accomplished. And here we are now. And the mission was not accomplished. But, and you know, I'm not here to defend President Bush. I can talk quite lengthily about his mistakes and misunderstandings. I, with my own poor English, can point at his mistakes in basic grammar, etc. And my English is very limited. But when I look backwards to some of the greatest American presidents and what they said in times of war and before, during, and after times of war, and what really happened, well, you have second thoughts about greatness. Okay, and I'll give you just very few examples for that. When Abraham Lincoln was elected to presidency, in order to avoid war, and you know the problem of slavery, countries which were states which were very much against it, etc., it was there for a long period of time, and it bothered at least 4 presidents before him. He promised in his first inaugural address that he's not going to abolish. He's against it. Okay? The only thing he's for is that he is against secession, and it didn't help him much. But when we look backward, we forget that. Of course, you know, there is a background to Lincoln, and he said things before, but that's his inaugural address, the first one, he said so. And look what happened. Let's say one more word about Lincoln. Towards the end of the war, which, by the way, cost 400,000 lives, okay? Compare that to Iraq. 400,000 lives. And, you know, the States was not as populated as it is today. And by the way, most of the casualties were Yankees, you know, people from the north. We have to remember that as well. I went the other day to Gettysburg. In one battle, there were 12,000 fatalities, okay? So, you know, look at things, you know, anyone, I regard myself personally as, say, a light, an indirect victim of war, of violence, okay? And I'm not going to bother you with details. I know what's war. There's nothing worse than war, okay? And of course we have to do anything in our power to avoid it. But you cannot really ignore the fact or claim that you know the future, okay, when you don't really know the past, okay? And the past, when the decisions were made, was uncertain. I can tell you for a fact that secret services in Israel were quite sure, wrongly so, we know that, they made a mistake, but they were convinced that there are weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein, no one will claim that, was not a saint. There is some history to that person. We cannot just wipe it up and say, well, you know, we know that post factum that it was a mistake when we don't really know the facts until now. You have really to remember that. Think about Wilson as another example. Many things that we see today in the Middle East, including even indirectly the shape of Iraq, came because of Woodrow Wilson. He also had a dream, a great dream. He was a great president. But he was elected for his second term with a promise that he will not enter the war. He entered the war, reluctantly, and saved the world. Let me tell you something as an Israeli, okay? I can give a full-year course easily talking about the unfortunate politics and the twisted procedures of American politics. It is so easy, but you know, the world, the positive side of the world is as is because of the United States. You know, the United States saved the world twice, reluctantly, okay? FDR was not so anxious to enter the war. We all remember why and when he entered, okay? And Woodrow Wilson, well, he was the one who really thought about the League of Nations, but couldn't enter because he couldn't reach the majority in the Senate, okay? But he thought about decolonization, the first one, and it was later adopted by not only the League of Nations with the mandates system, etc., but later by the UN, okay? But the United States played a leading role with all the mistakes, okay? With all the uncertainties, with all the personal political ambitions, corruptions, whatever you have. You cannot just wipe it up and say, well, nothing really happened. I don't really have too much time, and I know that I talk here as a preacher because, you know, some of the things that I heard here really hurt me. You know, not as American. I'm the only one who is not American on that side of the place where we are. I'm the only one. But, you know, I cannot just let it go and forget about everything. And let me say a few things about the future and about what should be the thoughts behind our decisions. First of all, let me be concrete and say that this is another world. We live now in another kind of world with other kinds of war and different kinds of threats. And it's not what we had in the past, okay? We don't fight the same wars anymore. And in my opinion, one of the worst threats to the whole world, and Israel is in the front line, but it's not the only country which is threatened, is the possible combination between people who are extremists, people that for good reasons, like 72 virgins or being oppressed or whatever, are ready to sacrifice themselves, okay, to be involved to be bomb suiciders. You have this kind of extremism today, and you have such a vast phenomena. So that's one fact, and it can be combined with availability of mass destruction weaponry. Okay? That's a combination. That's a frightening combination. And you cannot just sit and say, well, I'm not going to make mistakes. I'm not going to do anything. I'll just wait and see what happens. I'll be nice. I'll be clean-handed. You really have to fight this threat. By the way, when the war opened in Iraq, I thought that it was a mistake. I'll tell you the truth. And I thought that it can be handled differently, not by the regular means, by secret services, whatever. There are alternative means, which one should not specify. That's not the only way to win a war. But to say, you are not going to do anything, I think it's a very big mistake. Let me also say, I was born into a war 60 years ago, and I lived all my life in a troubled country, and I know many victims. But my conclusion is always to think about the other side. I never forget for a minute the misery of the Palestinians, the humiliation at the checkpoints. But I don't forget the danger. I think that one should pay any price possible to achieve peace. Nothing is worse than war. Nothing is worse than war. But to ignore the dangers, not to do anything, you have to be compassionate. You have to be generous. You have to be empathic. But you also have to be realistic. And you have to be determined. And you cannot really turn the world to be, some kind of paradise just by closing your eyes tight enough. That's my lesson. Thank you.
Professor Diskin, I want to compliment you, but throw something out to you also, because you talk validly that you can't deal with the future unless you understand the past. And I totally agree with that. But having said that, I'm going to deal with the future, all right? And the point I want to raise on this, because the issue validly came out, are we any safer, et cetera. And it reminds me of a story I must share with you. I'm going to go very quickly because I want to get questions and answers here. Is that I was on a panel in Oklahoma, my old university, with George Tenet and Gates. And both of them gave what I refer to as the threat du jour: rogue states, narco-terrorism, the usual list. And they're clearly good speechwriters, dealt with it. And I said, well, what about the strategic threat? What the Duke of Marlborough said, what happens over the horizon? And they looked at me, and any time any bureaucrat says to me, well, professor, I know I've been patronized. And the answer was, well, professor, we're too busy putting out today's fires. You have the luxury of engaging in strategic assessments. And I said, you mean to tell me we're spending billions of dollars and you're going to rely on professors like me in Oklahoma to engage in national strategy? That didn't bring off a very happy response on the part of the two colleagues. But it relates to something we deal with today. And again, I want to compliment the panel very, very much. Let me briefly talk about strategic assessment in a general sense. And I share, again, Dr. Diskin, your remarks about the dangers of looking at the future. I think that's a very good tonic. But to understand the nature of what's going on now, particularly in regards to terrorism, is clearly to have to look beyond the tragedy that we see in Iraq. Clearly, the carnage that has taken place in terms of state terrorism going back to Saddam Hussein, and the carnage justified in the names of politics or religion on the parts of any number of sects or groups, nonetheless, is also terrorism. But to understand the future of terrorism, and I say this with great circumspection, quite candidly, is not looking in the past, because we don't have time today, is to understand the fact that even, and God willing, and I think when I hear these people today speaking, and I hope whoever's in the administration listen to what they have to say, the fact of the matter is terrorism ultimately, like it or not, is a protracted form of conflict. It's a conflict ultimately which traditionally is used by those who are of a weaker power against a stronger power. And it's often referred to as asymmetric warfare. The fact of the matter, however, is, and it really, really troubles me now, is that the ultimate test, and this goes beyond the U.S., I want to emphasize this, in regards to are we safe or less safe. First of all, it's not simply we. Aside from the tragedies we see, for example, in Iraq itself, are we safe? Are the Spanish safe? Are the Germans safe? Are the Danish safe? Certainly, are the French safe? This has always been an issue. Because ultimately, terrorism is a psychological weapon. As Brian Jenkins of the Rand Corporation said many years ago, it's aimed at the people watching. And the bottom line of terrorism, whether you want to call it a form of violence or conflict or warfare or whatnot, it's a potent combination of politics to achieve political ends, but it is a form of psychological operations which ultimately is to test the resolve of people to deal with it. There is no such thing as a decisive victory in regards to terrorism. But the fact of the matter is, terrorism is an aspect of global conflict. If you use the word international terrorism, that is precisely what it is. Because like it or not, and I want to emphasize this, I certainly am not categorizing a great religion. There are those who have interpreted Islam in regard to the concept of Salafi jihadism as ultimately a commitment which is predicated not necessarily what's in this life, but as our colleague said, in the next life. You're dealing not with a battle necessarily solely of hearts and minds, as we talked about in Vietnam. You're dealing, in a sense, in a transcendental state with hearts and souls. And how do you deal with this small, but not that small group, who not only says history is on that side, but it's been divinely ordained by their interpretation of their religion? When you're dealing with that kind of certitude, you have to recognize another fact, that these individuals and the young men and women who will follow them view that this is indeed a, quote, and I don't like the term, but I'm going to use it, a long war. It can take 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But what makes matters more significant to me now is we see an assertion particularly of a concept that is not self-determination predicated on the concept of the nation state in a clearly defined area. It is now, in essence, a commitment to a concept of the caliphate and a concept, if you will, of a transcendental system that ignores the arbitrary boundaries of the nation state, which reflect to those who hold it the destruction of the Westphalian Western model, which basically, to those who share this view, say it was imposed by the Western Europeans in such periods as the Congress of Vienna. What is especially troubling on this is if you want to talk about the center of gravity, as it's said, for this conflict, a lot of it is now taking place in Europe. For a variety of reasons, we have a wide variety of young men and women who disaffected, and understandably so, not necessarily by their educational level, which is considerably higher than their parents in many instances. We are seeing a new form of conflict, call it what you will, and particularly for democracies. I'm not talking about Iraq. I'm not talking about Iran. I'm talking about the U.S. I'm talking about the UK. You name it. We now face the most classic problem of all. It's not Iraq. It's not Baghdad. We have to deal with these issues. And I agree with you. You cannot close your eyes to the reality of terrorism. But here's the reality. Do you want to live in an environment where you have a siege mentality? Do you always want to have a sense of fear? Do you always want to accept, right, security, right, over freedom? And one of the fundamental issues this campaign has not addressed, to my mind, one way or the other, are two things. One is the broader issue, which gets a lot of emotion without substantive discussion. And that is the issue, the classic issue of reconciling civil liberties and due process and personal freedom. The only way terrorism wins, and it does win, as a tactic, I'm not even going to say as a strategy, is when people buy into fear and overreact. Thank you very much.